All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and in this video, we are continuing our series responding comprehensively to Erika from the Gutsick Gibbon YouTube channel. Now, this one, we are primarily focusing on continuing our response to the Y chromosome challenge, and specifically her video titled "The Y Chromosome Supports Human Evolution." What you are going to see from this ongoing series is that the Y chromosome actually confirms biblical creation and separate ancestry. And so, what I want to do is get right into the fun and continue our response. And so, what I'll say is that I recommend people check out part 1 if they have not yet seen it, as part 1 is kind of a two-parter. I first respond to Erika on the radio halo dating method and accelerated nuclear decay topic. And then I get into the first 4 or 5 minutes of her video that we're going to be discussing and responding to here. Now, one thing that I find very interesting is the fact that Erika believes that these newest papers coming out on the Y chromosome actually works towards supporting or confirming evolution, or human evolution to be specific, when in fact the data, and I'm extremely excited about this because I've been using this argument, I've been looking to this data for a while to answer the question of ancestry. And it turns out that the data that you can find in the newest papers coming out on this issue, specifically one here, this is simply one of the visuals from the paper, this specific paper, actually strongly confirms what I've been saying and predictions I've been making in the world of ancestry. And so I've presented many times on this topic, and here is a visual that I have very frequently looked to in discussing this topic with those of the evolution persuasion, guardians of common descent, as I like to call them. And so this picture comes from a paper in 2017, The Y Chromosomes of the Great Apes. And so you'll notice here that your human Y chromosome is extremely different from the chimpanzee Y chromosome. And you'll notice right off the bat that it's half the size. So right away, you're at 50% difference. The gene content is totally different. The architecture, in terms of overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, the human Y and the chimpanzee Y are only about 35% the same. 35% the same. This is fascinating. And apparently they split from a common ancestor about 6 million years ago. So these differences would have had to arise within that 6 million years since the split. And then from here, your lineages of the chimpanzee and bonobos come about, supposedly. But in this 2023-2024 study, the data actually powerfully confirms what I've been saying based on this comes from the conventional literature, and yet it matches perfectly with what I've been putting forth as the separate ancestry model. So you have your human Y, which is distinct. As a matter of fact, the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y when you consider overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, which we should be doing. The evolutionists oftentimes, they want to just focus on gene content because they're presupposing evolution. They are assuming, going into the interpretation of this data, that humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor that they've split from. Okay. And so that's why you'll see them talk about rapid evolution, faster substitution rates. Okay. And just mutation rates in general. They'll say, well, there's a deletion here, a duplication here, or a chromosomal rearrangement here. And so let's just focus on, gene content, for example. Well, again, that's presupposing evolution. That's presupposing there was a common ancestor 6 million years ago. Show me this common ancestor. I want to see the DNA. I want to see the genetics of this hypothetical or imaginary common ancestor. No, we need to look at the data for what it is. Here is a visual representation of more or less what the chromosomes look like, which has been confirmed in this newest study here. And so, no, we're not going to only look at, let's say, gene content or alignable regions. No, we're going to look at it all. Okay. Heterochromatin here, we talked about this in episode 1 of this series, isn't even present, as far as I can tell, here in the chimpanzee Y chromosome or the bonobo Y chromosome, or there's just very little. Okay. And so when was all that lost? Where's the evolution of these gene families? Novel changes here. Okay. And so according to my created kind model, the model I would hold to, I would have humans as their created kind, their own kind. Chimpanzees and bonobos would go back to their own archetype. Okay. Their own common ancestor. So they belong to the same created kind. Gorillas is their own, which makes sense in light of the Y chromosome of the gorilla. Compare the gorilla Y with the chimpanzee Y and the bonobo Y. They're nothing alike. It's incredible. It truly is fascinating. Right here is an extremely convincing and just a great answer to the phylogeny challenge. Show created kinds. Militant evolutionists R and Ra asks. Well, here you go. And then your orangutans, very similar, as you can see here, and some differences, but not an overwhelming amount of differences. Not the kind of differences that can't be explained in 4,500 years since the flood. Just like chimpanzee and bonobo. Okay. Yeah, there's some differences, but nothing that can't be explained in 4,500 years since the flood. Nothing really all that significant. But once you bring in the human Y or the gorilla Y, the differences are massive. They truly are incredible differences. And so the latest data based on research into this topic and based on new or updated DNA sequencing technologies. Okay, these technologies have progressed rapidly over over many years and has given scientists the ability to analyze the Y chromosomes basically from end to end. Like we have a good idea as to what we're looking at here. And so your orangutans would be their own created kind. Okay. And if you actually go and look at this visual, which we're going to get into quite a lot. So this is kind of just a sneak peek. This is just a teaser as we go through Erika's video. You'll find that your two orangutans are most similar to each other. Your bonobo and chimpanzee are most similar to each other. Your humans and gorillas extremely different and distinct. I mean, it is a great time to be a biblical creationist. I suspect Gutsick Gibbon, probably not, but you know what? Gutsick Gibbon I can't imagine how she wouldn't look at this if she understood at least the created kind model that I'm putting forth and think, wow, okay, like this is not what we're expecting from an evolutionary starting point. I mean, the Y chromosomes are vastly different. This does not look like common ancestry, guys. This does not look like common descent. Okay. And so you'll notice that. So if you were to take human here, okay, and then compare to human, 100%, of course, human to chimpanzee, 26.2%. 26. It's amazing. Take your human to gorilla. Extremely different. Separate kinds, not related. Okay. Look at your orangutans. Orangutans, very similar. 87.4%. 67.4%. Okay. And so what we're looking at is exactly what we would expect from the separate ancestry model. your biggest differences among those that we wouldn't say are related, okay, and those that are related, like your chimpanzee and bonobo over here, okay, and your orangutan. So orangutans go back to their own created kind. Chimpanzees and bonobos, they've descended from their own created kind, an archetype on the ark. And then humans, their own distinct kind, and the gorilla, same thing. Okay. So guys, this is just kind of a teaser. We're going to get into this into deep. If this is kind of confusing, this visual and what I'm doing here, no worries. We're going to get into it very thoroughly throughout this series. So let's move into continuing with Gutsick's video. Now, for those looking for what the previous response was to Gutsick Gibbon, because I've done thorough responses to her on junk DNA, the chromosome 2 fusion, and most recently, the heat problem. So Matt and I, we did about a 2.5-hour response on Gutsick Gibbon's latest video. Is Gutsick Gibbon right about the heat problem? The answer is no. That is a comprehensive program on the topic of the heat problem. So I do recommend people check that out. Okay, let's get into some more of our good friend Erika's video here on the Y chromosome. She's going to have to retitle this to the Y chromosome does not support human evolution. The Y chromosome dismantles human evolution. It precludes human evolution in the sense that it is discriminatory evidence. It demonstrates the validity of the Y chromosome, and the best that they have to offer is largely untested still, but the best they have to offer in terms of an explanation assumes common ancestry with the apes. That's why they can say things like, well, faster substitution rates, gene loss here, gene death here, gene duplication, because they're assuming that any differences that are present are the result of changes since the split. Okay, so they're really lacking at this point in a sophisticated response. So let's go here, guys. Let's have some fun.
Elephants and rats are to mice. Some creationists, like one Jeffrey Tompkins,
In part one, we ended with her talking about how there are more differences between species that we would say are a created kind, like tigers and lions and domesticated cats, than we find in humans and chimpanzees. So if we could say that tigers, jaguars, and lions, fair point, okay, deserves a response. And I did respond in the past video, so I'm just kind of reiterating here. So if we're going to say that those species are related and go back to a common felid archetype, okay, the same created kind, but yet they have more differences among themselves than humans and chimpanzees. Well, why won't we say humans and chimpanzees aren't related? Well, the answer is pretty clear, because from the biblical starting point, humans are distinct from the rest of the biological world. Humans start as two. God creates two people, Adam and Eve. Right off the bat, that restricts levels of genetic diversity. It actually matches what we find today, because every single human being is 99.999% the same. Very low genetic variation. That makes sense. God created two people. But in the biological world, we do find higher levels of genetic diversity. Of course, there's always an exception to the rule, but that doesn't overturn the rule. And this is a confirmed expectation, because according to our starting point, according to the Bible's description of origins, God created all forms of biological life. Animals were created in bulk, in populations. It wasn't just in two felids, two canids, two this, two that. No, they would have been in fully working, fully functioning ecosystems in large populations. So you'd have a lot more genes floating around those populations. Okay. Then your bottleneck at the flood is only one generation. It's one generation followed up by rapid and exponential growth. So a lot of that original heterozygosity or design diversity would be retained as the kinds get off the ark and begin to migrate. Some become isolated. Mechanisms for speciation. Okay, you get breakaway populations from parent populations, you get isolation, inbreeding, shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity, which is a state of more diversity or less diversity, and you get enough change, you get enough distinctiveness that you could say that this is a new species. But it's just variation within a kind, within that kind that originated from the ark, and then 2,000 years before that at creation. And so it appears, and the data seems to confirm this, that God created animals, engineered them with a greater potential to vary. Okay. And so, yes, we can compare animals in the biological world. Once you bring in humans, it's not necessarily apples to apples. Okay. It can be apples to oranges in many cases, because the great apes would be animals. They would go back at creation to a created kind that was created in bulk, more diversity. Okay. But the most important thing is that we're looking at huge differences here, massive differences that the evolutionary model simply can't account for. And that is a major challenge to proponents of common descent. Here we go.
Have attempted to play down this number using their own work, but extensive investigation here on this channel and elsewhere have revealed that Tompkins' methodology fails at just about every level, which is supported by the fact that creationists for the most part seem to cite him less and less every year. So we're stuck with this then, the creationists are, that humans and chimpanzees are all.
The whole Tompkins controversy, I would say, is not 100% relevant here, because in terms of whole genome comparisons, you can go with a 95 to 96% similarity between humans and chimpanzees. I talked about in the first episode that you bring in banana plants and supposedly we're 50% similar to banana plants. And so it's not a huge surprise in light of how much more similar we look in morphology, anatomy, and physiology to the chimpanzee than we do to a banana plant, that we'd be about 95 to 96% similar. Okay. I don't think it really matters, because again, the overall similarities, okay, homology is largely, I'm not saying completely, but largely agnostic to the debate. And so, since it's the differences that make all the difference, it is the Y chromosome that I would recommend, that I would suggest creationists look to. Okay. So rather than looking to the 85% similarity argument or the 88% similarity argument, that could be problematic, because a lot of that is based on the work of Dr. Jeff Tompkins, and Gutsick Gibbon has put out several videos challenging him on that. And so I'm not saying he's wrong, but as far as I know, I haven't seen Dr. Tompkins put out any kind of comprehensive response or rebuttal to Gutsick Gibbon's work on that. And so at this point, I would probably recommend creationists stick to the Y chromosome, because that is your big difference. That is the discriminatory line of evidence, is the Y chromosome. 95, 96% similarity, whole genome. Okay. We expect similarities. Human engineers build in homologous patterns. Why shouldn't God? We can explain those very simply. The Y chromosome, on the other hand, it is the differences in the genomes of biological organisms that are going to help answer the question of ancestry, because the differences in the Y chromosome are simply too massive, as we're going to see throughout this series, for the evolutionary community to explain. So bring the evolutionists right into the world of the Y chromosome. That is where the greatest challenge is for them. And it comes right from the conventional literature. They can't even use their typical fallacy. Oh, that's a creationist. Okay. Weak argument when they say that. But with the Y chromosome, the data, the dissimilarity, the incredible dissimilarity in the great apes and primates in general, it's right there in the conventional literature. They can't ignore it. And that's why they've done their best to advance these very weak rescue devices, faster substitution rates, sperm competition, gene conversion, faster rates of gene conversion, which simply aren't up to the task in explaining these massive differences, because you need to explain the evolution of entire new gene families, the loss of massive kinds of gene content. Okay. You saw in the visual there, the heterochromatin that's lacking in chimpanzees. So let's continue here.
Almost 99% similar in the coding base pairs of the genome, and at least 95 to 96% similar in the entire genome as a whole. And this is a greater similarity.
And we're supposedly 50% similar to a banana plant. Okay, yeah, God used the same building blocks, DNA, RNA, proteins. We're going to find similarities all throughout the biological world. It's not a big surprise that we share more with the chimpanzee than we do with the banana plant. So there is this natural nested hierarchy that exists in the biological world. Not a surprise.
Than many pairs of animals that creationists would happily insist are related because they are a part of the same kind, like lions and tigers, African and Asian elephants, or rats and mice. But then in 2013,
there is a lot of variation and a lot of potential for change, adaptation, and variation in those animal kinds, those animal species. Whereas in humans, not so much. You have humans created in two versus animals created in bulk. 2,000 years up to the flood. It's hard to say how many humans there were. Okay, but they probably weren't spread out all over the globe in the same way that animals were. They weren't created in populations, and the Bible describes the post-flood or the pre-flood world, at least leading up to the flood, the time leading up to the flood, as being a place full of violence and wickedness. Okay, so we would assume there's a lot of murder, and so the population could have actually been quite small. And then at the Tower of Babel, which happens after the flood, humans did not take God's command seriously to spread out in all parts of the globe. That's why you had to confuse the languages. So animals spread out first and begin adding more genetic diversity from that flood bottleneck, where humans, they stay in one area still, okay, before eventually they begin spreading out to all parts of the globe. So it makes sense why there are a lot of DNA differences within species of an animal kind, like felid or elephants or dogs, okay, canids.
a new paper came out, one that was quite spinnable. The paper was titled Chimpanzee and Human Y Chromosomes Are
I wouldn't call it spinnable. It's right there in the title. Chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are remarkably, so not just a little bit, but remarkably, incredibly, extremely divergent in structure and gene content. Huge differences, not predicted. The gold standard of science is making testable and falsifiable predictions. As usual with the evolutionists, this wasn't predicted, just like when we discovered that humans in general have low levels of genetic diversity. That wasn't predicted. And so what did they have to do? They had to come up with a rescue device, a post hoc, ad hoc explanation, and say, well, and made up this population bottleneck in the out of Africa scenario, which doesn't work, because that would be an extensive or an extended bottleneck, where you have humans existing in a small population and inbreeding for a long period of time. Ask the evolutionists how long, they don't really know, but let's say at least 1,000 years to take those levels of heterozygosity and shift them into states of homozygosity, less DNA diversity. Inbreeding will do that, but inbreeding also reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. And so that would have been a population that would have descended into accelerated genetic degeneration. And we're supposed to believe that that population of somewhere between 2 and 10,000, some say 30,000, suddenly spread out in all parts of the globe, seize dominion over the planet, eventually build and engineer these cars that we benefit from, our laptops here, the space shuttle. No, it's imaginary, it's fairy tales, and it's all derived from a post hoc, ad hoc explanation. Okay, so right here, chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are remarkably divergent in structure and gene content. You don't have to spin that. You don't. It's just right there. Scream separate ancestry. Challenges common descent. It's the evolutionists that actually have to spin it. That's why you got to be a good critical thinker when you read these papers. Look at the data for what it is. Okay, the data is oftentimes interpreted incorrectly by the evolutionists because they're presupposing evolution happens. So they got to put forth some stories and rescue devices to save the day for evolution.
Remarkably divergent in structure and gene content by Hughes et al. This was the first real attempt at comparing the Y chromosome between humans and chimps because the Y chromosome is notoriously very difficult to sequence due to tons of highly repetitive sequences. This wasn't the full sequencing, but it was a start, and it found something unexpected. The human and chimp Y chromosomes were far more different than what was expected. The abstract specifically says they found they differ radically in sequence structure and in gene content, implying rapid evolution during the...
That's why the new DNA sequencing technologies are so fascinating and helpful in this ongoing debate, because where prior it was more difficult, as Erika said, with the highly repetitive DNA regions, and there were long and complex repetitive DNA regions. And so these new technologies, a lot more sophisticated and advanced, they can do a complete, from my understanding, a complete read through these long and difficult chromosomal sections in the DNA. And even with these advanced sequencing technologies, it still overwhelmingly undermines evolution, because as I showed earlier at the beginning of this program, this episode, the data strongly confirms what I've been saying, what a lot of creationists have been saying about separate ancestry and the Y chromosomes, because you still have humans and chimpanzees incredibly different. You still have gorillas, very distinct, orangutans, very similar, and then chimpanzees and bonobos, although different, still very similar to each other compared to your other apes. And so there you go. You have your separate ancestry model. Humans, their own kind, chimpanzees and bonobos, their own kind. Their differences easily explainable in 4,500 years since the flood. And your gorillas, their own distinct kind, and your orangutans. So as time has gone on, the argument for special creation only becomes that much more convincing and powerful.
The past 6 million years, and they call it an extraordinary divergence. The figures in the paper are striking. They lay out a portion of what they sequenced and compared.
That's right. Extraordinary, unexpected, not predicted. Look at on her screen. And I appreciate her putting the visuals here. Okay, look at how different the human Y is from the chimpanzee Y. Entire section. This is the heterochromatin. You can see the color coding here. So heterochromatin, this densely packed pieces of DNA that largely comprise repetitive sequences like satellite DNA. And so notice in the human Y, okay, basically absent in the chimpanzee Y, only about half the size. And that's why I say when you compare overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, it's only about 35% the same. Apparently somewhere between 25 and 35-ish% the same. Okay, you can look at the other sections, type of gene content, and it's just vastly different. This is not what you see in the bonobos and chimpanzees. Okay, but when you bring in the humans, now there's incredible differences that need to be explained. Not just, well, sperm competition. No, let's see a sophisticated model. When, how, why, where did all this happen? How did these changes happen?
The human and the chimp, and in fact they are radically different, with the chimpanzee portion also being much smaller, seemingly dwarfed. The authors note how odd this is compared to the rest of the entire genome, specifically displaying the difference between the human and chimpanzee.
Right, and as we talked about before, the Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. It's passed down paternally, and so it lacks recombination for the most part, okay? And so one would think it would be more stable because you're not having recombination in the same way you would with autosomal nuclear DNA every single generation, and yet it's the most different.
Y chromosome, which are again extraordinarily divergent, and the human and chimpanzee chromosome 21, which are...
God probably made it this way just to show how silly and implausible evolution is.
Almost identical. They don't mince words, and in the body, they say, indeed, at 6 million years of separation, the difference in the Y chromosomes in chimpanzees and humans is more comparable to the difference in autosomal gene content in chickens and humans at 310 million years of separation.
Think about that. Chickens and humans. That's how surprised they were. How different are chickens and humans? Because the evolutionary model, they believe that your differences accumulate after divergence, right? Let's say you have a common ancestor. Okay, humans and chickens, the evolutionists would argue, share a common ancestor. Okay, that split would have occurred a long time ago. And so there's been many lineages since, and there's been an accumulation of differences since. So basically the differences they see as being differences due to time since the last common ancestor. So that's why when they look to humans and chimpanzees, they're presupposing that humans and chimpanzees go back to a common ancestor. And so all the differences have to be explained through evolutionary change. And that's why they say rapid evolution. They're not questioning evolution. They're not questioning whether or not evolution happened. They're assuming it happened. It's not even on their mind that it didn't happen. The human and chimpanzee Y chromosome could be 2% the same, and they're still going to put forth rescue devices. They're not going to say in their conclusion section, evolution didn't happen, special creation is true. That's never going to happen, because that's never going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal where these authors have to presuppose that evolution happened. Okay, and look at how surprised they were. But rather than saying, maybe humans and chimpanzees aren't related, now they're going to propose some solutions. Just proposing anybody can propose a solution to anything. Okay, why isn't the moon made out of green cheese? Well, maybe this, and that, maybe this in the past, or that. Anybody can make up a story. Okay, but you see right here in the paper that this is as shocking as the differences with chickens and humans. Now, it is autosomal DNA that we're talking about, but that's the point they're trying to make.
The creationists went ballistic at this. They absolutely loved it, and naturally just skipped the portion in the conclusion that attempts to explain why this disparity.
Attempts to explain. Yeah, everybody's going to have a rescue device. You got your worldview, you have your belief system, you got your presuppositions. They're not going to say, well, looks like humans and chimpanzees aren't related because these differences are massive. They're unexpected. We did not predict them. We understand as Christians. I wrote an entire book called the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, where I went over very thoroughly dozens of ERV papers. And yes, they don't conclude that this is the result of special creation. They've always got a spin. So the ones that are spinning the data are the evolutionists. Okay, just because there's a proposed solution, if it's not tested, and these are largely untested, if it's not empirical, we're not forced to accept those solutions. They don't work.
Might exist, specifically pointing to sperm competition in the Pannons as opposed to Homo sapiens. This is true. Pannons, the chimps, and the bonobos have a drastically different social system and reproductive strategy as
they're drastic social systems. Okay, there are differences in social systems and mating strategies and sperm competition. Yeah, that makes sense in light of the differences between humans and chimpanzees. Okay, because it's not these massive differences that you see between humans and chimpanzees and bonobos. Just saying sperm competition, even though entire sections of genes are missing, it's half the size. The heterochromatin's not even there. You'd have to explain the evolution of entire new gene families. No, saying sperm competition is not going to cut it. It's reasonable for the humans or for chimpanzees and bonobos, sure. It's reasonable. And so we can believe that. We can adopt that as a creationist and say, yeah, that would largely explain the divergence in gene content since the flood. But once you bring in humans or even bring in gorillas, now you're in imagination land.
as compared to Homo sapiens, which probably explains why these differences exist on the Y chromosome and seemingly nowhere.
Now, the reason why you'll see them forced to say things like maybe this, probably this, perhaps that, it's because these do go largely untested. It's just a proposed solution. Okay, and even if true, they have to demonstrate that these differences can accumulate in the human lineage and the chimpanzee if they descend from a common ancestor. So you can say it all day and you can believe it all day. Okay, we're not against you, but believing what you want. But to call it science, that's the problem, because at this point, it's not science.
Or else in the genome. This is important as a prediction, and we'll come back to it later. But needless to say, the Y chromosomal dissimilarity between humans and chimpanzees excited creationists greatly.
Sneak preview, it's not going to make any difference. The newest data that I've already given you a sneak preview confirms a separate ancestry model and still challenges overwhelmingly the universal common ancestry model.
Particularly because it was relatively unexpected. Finally, a single part of the genome that was as different as the creationists wanted it.
But a unique part of the genome, a uniparentally inherited, non-recombining part of the genome.
to be. Except not actually. The primary difference between the human and chimpanzee Y was actually their size. The chimpanzee Y chromosome had numerous large-scale deletions, and
they don't even see when when they go from science to story, science to imagination, science to myth. Let's rewind that and we'll go slower. Presupposing that the chimpanzee line had deletions. Oh, really? When, where, how, how? Show us where in the split did these happen? How did these happen? How did the deletions happen? Okay, let's see.
Numerous large-scale deletions, and except not actually. The
I love when
primary
they do
difference
this.
between the human and chimpanzee Y was actually their size. The chimpanzee Y chromosome had numerous.
So notice, huge difference in half the size. So you're starting at 50% difference. And now Erika, presupposing that evolution happened, is saying, well, the chimpanzee lineage experienced these massive deletions. Oh, really? Can you prove that? These are in a debate. This is an assertion. Back up your claim, back up your assertion, because assertions are meaningless, absolutely meaningless. This is story. Evolutionists hope, dream, and imagine that they're related to banana plants. They're 50% the same as humans, right?
Large-scale deletions.
Chimpanzees experience large-scale deletions. Well, thank you for the assertion. Assertions ain't going to work, not in the scientific world.
And after that, it had multiple different inversions and
after that, it happened to experience multiple different inversion mutation, I think she said. Oh, really? This right here is story time. Someone needs to transcribe what she's saying, print it out, put it into a nice, cute book, and put it in the mythology section. Okay, because that's all this is. And this is proving my point that they have to assume common ancestry going into the interpretation of this data. Chimpanzee lineage experience these large deletions, experience all these inversion mutations. You see how much they have to employ to save the day for their fairy tale story of ape to man evolution. You see, they're just writing. They're just writing a fiction book. Well, they had massive gene deletions here, some inversions here. It's like they're putting together. It's like it's a recipe for some fancy meal. She's baking a cake here. It really is flabbergasting that they don't see their presuppositions in this when they say this. That are they not thinking in their head like this is an assertion? I need to back it up.
Frame shifts and swap arounds that made it incredibly difficult to
frame shifts, swap here. Let's see if you remember this. Frame shifts, swap arounds, and large deletions and inversions. Oh, what a story. What an amazing story. So they're half the size, massively different. Why? Well, the chimpanzee lineage experienced inversions, massive deletions. See, they got to say massive deletions too, because that's how different it is. Frame shift mutations, swap arounds, I think she said. It's truly incredible.
Align to the human counterpart. When you actually looked at the identity of the sequences between the human and chimp Y, they were as.
See, they only want to look at the sequence identity. And she does look a bit angry right here. And I would be too, because you know what? They have a lot invested in evolution being true. Okay, they have a lot invested in this idea, this fairy tale idea that humans are related to banana plants. It's simply not the case, guys. Okay, and just because a PhD might say that humans are related to mosquitoes does not make it so. And so it is a major problem when they have to resort to assertions and claims, but yet they can't back up that these deletions happened, that these inversions. They see the differences, and now it's like building a cake. It's like baking a cake, I should say. And so they're looking to their ingredients. What's going to make this work? Some inversions here. There's your ingredient. Couple frame shift mutations, a little bit of swap arounds. No. Okay. And then they want to say, oh, see, so we really just have to focus on the sequence identity because we know these deletions happen. So although they're only 30% the same, we can just forget that because we know. Oh, really? That's what they have to demonstrate, but they can't.
Similar as expected. Additional work that included a preliminary look.
Notice how she says as expected. The entire topic here in this series, the Y chromosome, none of it was expected. It wasn't predicted. We just saw in the excerpt that it's like chickens, and the differences are akin to chickens and humans, which split apparently 300 million years ago.
Look at the gorilla Y chromosome showed that gorillas and humans were actually more similar in gene architecture, and humans and chimps were more similar in sequence identity.
We're not picking and choosing what we're going to compare. We're going to take the Y chromosomes. We're not going to assume anything. We're not going to assume special creation. We're not going to assume evolution. We're just going to look at the Y chromosomes and we're going to compare them. Pretend you know nothing about ancestry. And you have the human Y, the gorilla Y, the chimpanzee Y. Just compare them. Don't assume anything has happened in the past. Okay. And when you consider the whole Y chromosome, which is what we need to do to be faithful to good science, so that means you're considering the size, the architecture, you're considering the gene content, the sequences. When you consider everything, the human Y is more like the gorilla Y than either are to the chimpanzee Y. And this is a break in the nested hierarchy. Now, the evolutionists, presupposing evolution, they can't get away from that, assuming going into this that humans and chimpanzees split from a common ancestor, and that humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas also split from a more distant common ancestor. Now they have to say, well, these differences exist because frame shift, inversion, deletion, swap arounds. No, that's not going to cut it. It's not science.
A geneticist friend of mine illustrated it to me like this. Imagine you have a VHS copy of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and then that VHS copy has two other versions of the movie, right? In one version, it is exactly the same as the first version, except the last 10 scenes are cut from the film inside the VHS tape. And in the third version, it's exactly the same length as that first copy, but instead of using wands every time the wizards pull out their weapon, they've got like a Glock. They've got like a gun. In what is actually happening within the tape, within the film, 1 and 2 are far more similar than 1 and 3 are, despite the fact that 1 and 3 are the same length. And in genetics, it is the sequence identity and not the size of the sequence that determines how
I don't see how that's a good illustration. I may have to go re-listen to it, but we know that Harry Potter film, okay, I mean, you get different versions of different films. You oftentimes get the unrated version, you get the director's cut, you get the theatrical version. That's why a lot of times the director's cuts are a lot better because they're longer, they have more scenes in there, which gives you more context. Okay, don't get me started on that. But the point is, we know that film, okay, all three versions go back to the same director, the same team that made them. Okay, but they don't know that humans and chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas go back to a common ancestor. We have today the Y chromosomes. We have their sequences. We have the data, and we know they're extremely different. We don't know that they go back to a common ancestor. As a matter of fact, the differences are so huge, so incredible that they can't be related. It precludes human evolution.
closely related two things are. That's how we do it when we're making pedigrees using sequenced genomes, after all. Add on top of that this is the Y chromosome, right? So this would suggest in kind of a roundabout way that male humans are very divergent from chimps, but female humans are not. And specifically, the gene content difference that did exist between the human Y and the chimp Y, those genes were expressed most commonly in the testes. So the idea that that would be the delineation point for the humankind and the rest of the ape kind is very odd to me. Now, needless to say, creationists didn't care about all of this minutia. They simply liked to point to the Y.
See, and I do want to point one thing out, because the biggest issue that she has is with the chimpanzee and bonobo Y chromosomes, okay? And so, firstly, I do want to point out 2020, they still admit our hypothesis is that, and you can read that yourself, mating habits, sperm competition, none of this is new, okay? But they think, sure, that this rescue device will work. It has to work because, again, they can't admit that evolution is false, but they admit that it needs to be evaluated in subsequent studies. And I would still argue that it still goes largely untested. I'm not even sure how you can test it in a sophisticated manner, because you're going to have to provide a mathematical model, a very detailed mathematical model showing where these changes happened after the split, how they happened, how they accumulated over time, and led to what we see today. It's not just gene loss, or gene deletions, the evolution of new genes and gene families. Okay. And so again, you can see here your human Y and your chimpanzee Y, totally different gene content, architecture, size differences. Your bonobo and chimpanzee are still very, I mean, these could be explained being related, even in a short amount of time. But most important here, chimpanzees versus bonobos, what we know from the 2024 data, the differences between chimpanzee and bonobo Y chromosomes reflect diversity in structural rearrangement, not gene content. That's a lot more simple than what we find in the humans and the chimpanzees, because what they're going to have to do with humans and chimpanzees, not just structural rearrangements, okay, but they are now going to have to apply mathematical models to try to demonstrate how a sequence can change extremely rapidly, including wholesale rearrangement of significant parts and the evolution. So this is the important part. The evolution of entire gene families in a relatively short amount of time, yet stay homogeneous within a species. This is going to be very difficult for them. And this is all confirmed in the latest data. It's not looking good for the evolutionists here.
And say, haha, see, it's too divergent between humans and chimps for them to share a common ancestor. Or, haha, see, isn't it weird that the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than the chimp Y? Isn't that suspicious and surprising?
The Y chromosome dissimilarity, this preclusionary line of evidence that suggests evolution, simply can't be the case. Because when you consider overall architecture, gene content, size differences, your human Y chromosome and chimpanzee Y chromosome, they're only about 35 to 40% the same. They're half the size, ton of the gene content is totally different.
I specifically responded to both of those points in videos multiple times.
Her responses have all failed. We've responded to her responses. I've challenged many evolutionists in debate. Last year, we did an open mic debate challenge series where we did evolution open mics. Some of them went 5 to 6 hours every couple weeks for basically a year. Okay. There is hours and hours and hours. And did I say hours worth of debate on my channel from last year, from 2023, debating all evolutionists. And I essentially engaged nearly every evolutionist, including Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, on the Y chromosome dissimilarity, and none of them had a good answer. Some even, like Mr. Anderson, when I pressed him and said, are you ready, like basically to put money on it? Are you ready to say that you're confident with sperm competition? He said no. And we can pull up that clip. I can't remember exactly how it went, but it was something like that, where he admitted in real time that no, like, because they're recognizing that, yeah, this is largely just a story, because Erika should have shown my visual here, which comes from the conventional literature. She showed me saying that, but why don't you actually show the visual to your audience? Because this visual is very powerful, where any objective thinking person is going to look at this and be like, wow, you're arguing that humans and chimpanzees go back to a common ancestor. Look at this Y chromosome versus this Y chromosome. It's not just a little bit different. It's remarkably different. Okay. Line up your gorilla and Y. Yeah, you can see why the authors say that they're a lot more similar. And I'm not just making this up. Look, this is right from this paper in 2020. Despite a recent divergence of these species, see, they assume, going into these papers, they assume that this happened. They did diverge. They do have a common ancestor. Now, why are they so different? They're not asking if it even happened. Their Y chromosomes differ enormously in size and gene content. Yeah, you can see that in the visual. The chimpanzee Y is only half the size. Okay, so right off the bat, you're starting with 50% of the human Y. And the percentage of gene families shared by these two chromosomes, notice this, gene families, 68%. That's split. So here they go, assuming you got to read between the lines. This is critical thinking. Okay, schools now, they're teaching you what to believe. They're teaching you what to think rather than how to think. No, you need to think. You need to think through these, critically think. Was there actually a split? This is what you need to be asking yourself. That split more than roughly 6 million years ago is similar to that shared by human and chicken autosome. So they're reiterating that point from the earlier paper. That split 310 million years ago. Notice this, puzzlingly. So 2020, it's still a puzzle. In terms of shared genes and overall architecture, the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y. I am not making this up. This is right from the secular literature or conventional literature. And then here's the assumption again. Presuppositions at play, always with the evolutionists. Even though human and chimpanzee have a more recent common ancestor. Do they? Do they have a more recent common ancestor? Do they have a common ancestor? They won't even question that basic assumption. Okay? So yeah, the gene families are totally different. You're going to have to explain not just losses or rearrangements, but the evolution of genes and gene families. Okay, so let's play a little bit more. We'll start to wrap up part 2 here.
Early on in this channel, and for a while they didn't really talk about the Y, at least the YouTube ones didn't talk about the Y, but it seems as though lately they've had a little bit of a resurgence, which is exactly why I've decided to come back and kind of bust this topic. Well,
I think with all the time Erika spent on the heat problem, her favorite topic, and I do appreciate engaging her on the heat problem, she simply missed the fact that no, there hasn't been a resurgence of this topic. It's always existed. We've been engaging, I've been presenting on the Y chromosome steadily and consistently since basically our first debate going back probably 4 years ago now. Time flies by when you're having fun. 4 years ago, I debated Erika on Modern Day Debate. And so, I mean, we both learned a lot since then, that's for sure. And the debate has evolved, no pun intended, in many ways since then. But you can go back to that debate from so long ago. And I was bringing up the Y chromosome. Okay. And it hasn't gotten any easier for the evolutionists since then.
that and the fact that a new paper came out recently that absolutely beats it to smithereens for me. So when you boil it
No, the new paper absolutely beats human evolution to smithereens. For me.
down, the Y chromosomal argument from creationists can kind of be summarized as point one, there was an unexpected thing in evolutionary biology. The
Yes, not predicted.
Y chromosome between humans and chimps was significantly more different than we expected, therefore evolution bad. They don't provide a mechanism.
That's right. Yeah. If evolution can account for these differences, that's why I like to say it's the differences that make all the differences, that make all the difference. Then, yeah, that is a challenge. That is a burden on the evolutionists to explain. They're the ones that want to say this is science. They're the ones that hold strictly to naturalism and materialism. That's not our starting point. Okay. We're not strict materialists. We're not strict naturalists. So you need to explain these differences. The ball's in your court.
Or any kind of like experimental reason as to why the Y couldn't be that divergent. They just point at it and say unexpected, that is bad.
No, we've laid it out. It's been laid out for quite a while here. Here's an excerpt that I've been showing for a while. Dr. Rob Carter, I think, laid it out beautifully. Okay. And so he says they are now going to have to apply mathematical models. I'm going to add the word sophisticated in there to try to demonstrate how a sequence can change extremely rapidly. So there's a lot of change, but according to evolutionary time, it's a lot of change in a short amount of time, including wholesale rearrangement of significant parts. So it's not even just a few rearrangements. Okay. No, it's wholesale rearrangement of significant parts and the evolution of entire gene families. Again, that's key. The evolution of entire gene families. What happened to all the heterochromatin, for example, in the chimpanzee and bonobo lineages? Okay. In a short amount of time. So yeah, we've given detailed explanations and arguments in terms of what needs to be explained and presented for you to still say or argue that evolution is science or human evolution.
So point number one should be we need to see an actual mechanism as to why they propose the Y chromosomes couldn't become that divergent, but we'll get there when we get there. Point two is this sort of inference, this sort of soft implication, I should say, that the Y chromosome might be what separates out the created kinds, at least amongst them.
Yeah, the evolutionary community, and especially those on YouTube like Aaron Ra or Gutsick Gibbon, they'll ask, and it's a fair question, what separates, where's this barrier in the biological world? Because they're assuming that everything's related through universal common ancestry, universally related. They go back to single-celled like ancestors billions of years ago, where we as creationists argue for what? Separate ancestry. Not everything is related. That's why I like sticking here too, because we stay as close to home as possible. If we can demonstrate that humans and chimpanzees aren't related, and that the great apes exist in multiple created kinds, then humans and strawberries or humans and pine trees definitely aren't related. So let's stay as close to home as possible, show why humans and chimpanzees can't be related, demonstrate separate ancestry that way, and then that definitely demonstrates that humans and strawberries aren't related. Okay, where if you start with humans and strawberries or humans and mosquitoes, well, you got a lot of work to do still to show that humans and chimpanzees aren't related. But if you show that humans and chimpanzees aren't related, then again, that means that humans and strawberries aren't related. Okay, because there's a break in your universal phylogenetic tree of life. And so that's a problem for the evolutionary community. So yes, it's a fair question. Where's this barrier? Where do we draw a line? Well, we can look to the Y chromosome. We can look to linkage blocks. We can look to mitochondrial DNA. We can look to orphan genes, these taxonomically restricted and essential genes. Okay, there's a number of ways that we can do this. And the Y chromosome is just a very easy way to show where that line is. And we've been able to do so by showing several created kinds. Humans as their own created kind, gorilla as their own created kind, bonobos and chimpanzees as their own created kind, and then your orangutans. Okay.
The apes. Now, 4 years ago, when I covered this topic previously, I pointed to a paper that I felt did a good enough job absolutely quashing this argument. And that was this paper from 2016 by Oetjens et al. Titled Y Chromosomal Structural Diversity.
Okay, we're going to stop it here for now because this is where we get very heavily into these papers. She's going to talk a lot about, if I remember correctly, she's going to talk a lot about sperm competition here, and she's going to go into a lot of probablys, maybe this, perhaps this. So a lot of storytelling. As we've seen already in our teaser, these explanations simply don't work. They still largely go untested. But even in the latest data from this paper, we see exactly what I've been saying, that bonobos and chimpanzees are most similar. Orangutans, very similar. And your humans and your gorillas, very distinct. That gives us what we want. Humans as their own created kind, bonobos and chimpanzees going back to their own created kind, gorillas as their own distinct created kind, and then your orangutans. Okay, so this is a paper that we're really going to be digging into in the next couple of episodes. Okay, we're going to take as long as we need. We're putting this to bed, guys. We are putting an end once and for all to common descent. And as you can see, this is very new, published May 29th, 2024. And so the newest data that's out there decimates human evolution and powerfully confirms separate ancestry. And so, guys, thank you very much for tuning in to part 2. And I did it. We're at just an hour. So I'm trying to keep each episode in this series digestible, clear, concise as possible, and at about an hour. So the first one was about an hour, a little bit over. This one's at just about an hour. And so I hope everybody enjoyed. Stay tuned for video or episode number 3 in this very important series that absolutely wrecks human evolution. God bless.